morning, Merlin. I'm Nico Cookson, the head of corporate development for Marimaca Copper. We are developing the Marimaca oxide project in northern Chile. We view the project as a very unique and well-located development project with exceptional return on invested capital economics.
Nico, nice to get you in front of the camera finally. We've spoken in the past, but this is the first interview we've done directly with you. So good to be talking to you. Just by way of getting started, could you tell me how you came to join Marimaca and kind of what your background is?
Absolutely, yeah. So I got introduced to Hayden Locke, who's the president and CEO of Marimaca in early 2021 by a mutual connection in the industry. Was working and living in London at the time, and it was a project that through my past roles I was familiar with. It's obviously a very high quality development project, and prior to joining Marimaca, I was working in private equity and mining private equity in London, and it was a project that we were relatively familiar with at the shop I was working at. So when the discussion evolved with Hayden in terms of him wanting to bring on board someone in the corporate development arm of the business, those discussions evolved into me coming on board and joining the Marimaca team in September last year. So it's been just over a year in the seat, and obviously the project has come a long way since then. It's been a very, very busy year through the end of 2021 and through 2022 for Marimaca and the Marimaca project. So exciting times ahead, and very, very excited to be in this role and looking forward to the future.
So you're a mining analyst. That's the kind of best way of describing you. I know you're doing corporate development now, but your background and your training is as a mining analyst.
Correct. So I started my career in mining investment banking in M&A and corporate finance advisory. From there, moved into the principal investing arm in mining private equity, focused solely on investing on the equity side of the business in base metals and precious metals assets globally. And from there, across that experience, have been, like you say, looking at project analysis, valuation, and return profiles on mining investments, but have now transitioned, bringing all that experience into corporate development at Marimaca.
And life in the junior sector, it's quite different to life in the banking sector. A small company versus a big company. Presumably, you've got a variety of roles and responsibilities that you have to take on.
Correct. Yeah, I describe it as dynamic. I think we're a small team, and we obviously all have to be across the detail on every aspect of the company and the project. So fantastic learning experience to be on the corporate side of the business and moving this project forward. I think luckily with Marimaca, it's a project that sort of develops itself because of how high quality it is. But the team that Marimaca has pulled together at the project level is very, very experienced, and I think we're very well positioned for what should be an interesting 2023 as the project moves towards that definitive feasibility and ultimately construction phase.
Well, let's just have a quick look at Marimaca in 2022, because the share price is off 30% or so, 1/3, but it's performed well relative to its peers. But it's been a pretty torrid time across the market itself, and I guess you're behind or involved in creating the peer group comparisons for Marimaca that are included in the presentations. So could you just kind of tell me how you see the copper market performance, or kind of the main drivers of share price performances in this past year or the year to date?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we've seen a lot of copper price volatility in the last 10 or 11 months or so. I think largely driven by the volatility of macro financial flows. I think the copper price has certainly decoupled from what used to be a very supply demand driven market in terms of pricing. But I think fundamentally and on a long-term basis, we still remain very bullish towards the end of the decade as the structural deficits that we see in the copper market remain very, very true, and have actually been exacerbated by the price declines this year. So I think given Marimaca's alignment with coming online in sort of the 2026, 2027 timeframe aligns quite well with where we see prices going, copper prices going in that timeframe. So I think we expect some ongoing volatility for the next 6 to 12 months, but fundamentally in the long term we're not that worried about copper price.
But why do you say that the volatility in the metal price is going to affect the supply demand balance? Do you think exploration dollars have been curtailed? Do you think supply has been taken off the market just because we've had a dip in the low prices?
Yeah, certainly. I think, when you look at the marginal cost of production, there are assets out there that turn offline when you're in the low $3 copper price environment, where it's been sitting for, absent the last week or two, for the majority of the second and third quarter of this year. So, supply estimates that had copper price holding true at, say, 375 or 380 for 2022. That hasn't necessarily held true. So there has been supply coming offline in the short term. So certainly the estimates going forward into 2023 and 2024, we see those being constrained even further by the low prices across the copper market that we've seen this year. So that, and in addition to that, as you say, I think the market's very much gone slightly risk off this year in terms of equity dollars available for explorers and developers in the industry, which is obviously a critical component of making sure our development supply pipelines are full. So when there's no exploration dollars flowing into the ground, there's obviously no new discoveries. Marimaca, luckily, is, I think, one of the only major copper discoveries made in Latin America in the last 10 years. So we're not seeing many of those dollars flow back into the ground, and hence the supply pipelines are not being filled up for longer dated projects. It's
a double whammy, isn't it? Because not only is the exploration dollar harder to find, it's a triple whammy. The exploration dollar is hard to find, so it's harder to raise money for exploration. The money that companies do have is conserved. They go risk off. They don't spend as much on big drill programs. So actually, the money that was previously allocated to exploration kind of gets slightly pulled back or constrained. And then the final element of it is that when the equity valuations are crushed, the companies don't want to issue dilutive stock on their asset value. So then with the next capital raise they're likely to do is much smaller. And it's only when the metal prices really drive those valuations back up to reasonable levels that the equity, that the juniors raise money again. And so there's almost like a concertina effect. You can get a 6-month drop in metal prices, but it could lead to a 12 or possibly even an 18-month gap in the exploration dollar spend.
Absolutely.
Right now, the main catalyst for getting you on is to talk about your most recent news, which is about water. There's been lots of bad news about environmental stuff in Chile, but is this a ray of light? Or perhaps you could kind of tell us about this news release that went out on the 7th.
Sure, absolutely. So what we announced on the 7th was basically an option agreement with a water supplier in the Bay of Mejillones, which is the nearest port town to Marimaca. It's situated about 25 kilometers from the project site. And what we announced was an option agreement for life of mine water supply for the Marimaca project, Seawater supply. And this option agreement basically serves as the precursor to the water supply agreement that will execute upon final investment decision at the Marimaca project. So it guarantees us future volumes of supply for the project of seawater from the Bay of Mejillones. And I think this is significant for a number of reasons. And the core one being, Marimaca's sustainability positioning. We're obviously a project that can operate with seawater as our process water. Groundwater is obviously a very sensitive issue in Chile right now. If you look at the WoodMac numbers, freshwater usage in the Atacama region of Chile, about 50% of that usage is accounted for by the mining industry. So it's a critical component of getting any project permitted in Chile at the moment. And I think it positions Marimaca very well because we do not need to rely on a freshwater source in order to get our operation constructed and operating. And by partnering with one of the power and water suppliers in the Bay of Mejillones, we removed the need to even permit a seawater intake in the Bay of Mejillones too. So the process for us now will be basically getting the pipeline route from the Bay of Mejillones to the project permitted via an easement. But the project will operate with seawater for its life of mine, and this agreement guarantees that for us.
Remind me what are the main water uses in an SXEW process? I mean, because the tanks themselves are quite small. You've got tailings. You've got it's not a particularly water heavy process, is it? Although
No,
it is it is hydrometallurgy.
Yes, I mean the majority of the water usage gets accounted for in the heap leaching process. So we will have collection ponds at Marimaca, and the seawater will be used and combined with our acid supply to basically irrigate our heap leaches. Now, the SXEW portion of the plant requires some water usage, some freshwater usage. So there's an element of our plant that has a smaller reverse osmosis plant for a countercurrent wash to remove that salt and make sure that we have a clean process in the SXEW portion of the plant. But the majority of our process water is used in the front end in the heap leaching process. And the 5 phases of metallurgy, a very extensive metallurgical program that Marimaca has completed to date. We've completed with both freshwater and seawater actually sourced from the Bay of Mejillones as our testing water. And this, seawater usage is precedented in Chile right now. There are a lot of operations that have made the transition or are thinking about making that transition. So I think Marimaca will lead the way in terms of one of the new projects constructed with solely seawater as its process water being used.
Did you get better results with saltwater? Because I have come across leaching heap leach copper operations in Chile that have actually added salt to their water. So yes. I just wondered, did you get any, was there a measurable difference in recoveries using seawater over freshwater?
It actually does benefit. The chloride that comes from the seawater actually does benefit our leaching process, particularly when you move beyond the green oxides into more of the mixed and secondary sulfide leaching. So there is actually a marginal benefit to us for using the seawater as on top of all of the obvious sustainability and ESG benefits that come with sourcing water directly from the sea. And there is there's benefits to both sides, us and our partner, in terms of using the seawater, because basically the origination of the water is from the back end of the thermal power plants that are based in Mejillones. They intake seawater and circulate that water as cooling water for their stations. And rather than retreating that water from a temperature perspective and pumping it back into the ocean, they're actually able to then divert it to us, recycle that water to use it as processed water at Marimaca, for example. There are operations like Sierra Gorda, that's relatively close to Marimaca, that source their water on a very, very similar framework from the Bay of Mejillones.
But through the same power plant?
Different power plant, but same overall
concept.
Structure, and concept.
And I noticed your news release was very careful not to describe it as a thermal or a coal-fired power station. Maintain the green credentials.
Yes, I mean many of the plants, when I say thermal, many of them operate on gas, so many of them have transitioned away from thermal coal. But in the Bay of Mejillones, some of them are remain coal, and some of them are gas.
Good. That is a crucial step, because that is one of the key obstacles, key milestones for any project in Chile, is obtaining the water. So tick. Could you give any comment on the environment generally, or the atmosphere generally regarding environmental permits? Because there are very mixed reports coming out of Chile over here. It's not just applicable to the mining sector, but also to all construction permits, that there's been kind of quite a radical approach taken to issuing of construction permits. You may not be in the permitting phase at the moment, but kind of any commentary on that would be, I think, useful for the listeners or the viewers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think each project in Chile is unique in terms of its approach to permitting. It's a very diverse country in terms of where projects are located and what the implications are for the permitting process for each asset. I think where Marimaca benefits is that we are very, very well positioned from a permitting perspective in terms of the execution risk for the project itself. We are not in the high Andes where water and flora and fauna are potentially an issue. For example, we are located in the coastal Cordillera. But I think, overall in Chile, there's certainly been increased scrutiny on moving projects through the permitting process, and I think rightfully so. we are moving to a world where sustainability needs to be a core focus. So, projects need to be governed with the appropriate oversight during the permitting process. But, for Marimaca, we are well positioned from that perspective. And I think now that we are moving into the definitive feasibility stage and really that permitting phase, that represents the critical path for the project going forward. So the team in country and ourselves will be very, very focused on getting our preparations done for our permitting submission in late 2023. So that very, very much represents the core focus for the business right now, in addition to moving towards and kicking off the definitive feasibility study.
So you've already started your long lead items, such as environmental baseline monitoring, kind of multiple quarters of air and water and flora and fauna studies.
That's correct. Yes. So those studies have been ongoing actually since the PEA was published in 2020. There have been multiple iterations. They obviously have to be kept up to date, but the long lead time items that will support the permitting submission in 2023 are underway, and baseline studies have been rolling through the year as we move through the seasons. So preparations are underway. I think now that the updated resource was released in October, where we saw a notable scale up in the size of Marimaca overall, I think we have a good idea of where the project sits from sort of a scope perspective as we move into the DFS, in terms of where we see production scale coming out and life of mine coming out for that study. We believe that there will be a material step change from the scale in the PEA. So now that we have sort of the overall framework of what will drive that study, which is the underlying mineral resource, we can start moving forward with the engineering phases of that permitting submission, et cetera, that now that we have the overall sort of scale concept almost locked down.
Call me old-fashioned, but isn't the tried and tested method to do a PEA it's very glib to say what it might be, and then the PFS is to describe what it should be, and then you do the detailed engineering and a feasibility study to say what it will be. But those trade-off studies, that scaling, those option studies in the PFS is such a crucial step. Are you sure it's a good thing to skip it and go straight to DFS?
Yeah, I mean, I think good question, and it's something it's a question we get a lot regarding moving from the PEA to the DFS. I think where Marimaca differs slightly is that the PEA study that was released in 2020, the resource side of it was very much playing catch up with the balance of the inputs that went into that study in terms of converting our inferred into measured and indicated, and that the main driver of why we had to call that study a PEA in 2020 was just because we had not drilled the inferred to a high enough density that we could move it to M&I. So that's very much been the focus for 2022 for Marimaca. We obviously have this interim resource out that we published in September, and come February next year, we'll look to publish another updated resource, moving most of our inferred into M&I, so we can use that in our mine planning for the DFS. But the 2020 PEA was informed on sort of the capital breakdown and the operating cost breakdown by budgeted quotes from providers to PFS level. So under 43-101, we obviously were required to call it a PEA because of the inferred resources that we were included in that mine plan. But we are very much confident in the estimates that we have from that study moving forward. And there have been a number of option studies completed between that point in time and now that we'll take forward into our planning for the DFS.
But you said that the scope has changed. I mean, surely just by the change of the scope, in a sense, you've almost got to kind of re-engineer at that level to kind of incorporate all of you need to scope out. You need to run the numbers on a series of mining rates, mine lives, throughputs, scheduling, orientation of pits, a whole different array of configurations of those kind of key components.
Correct. And I think where Marimaca benefits immensely by the nature of our ore body is that geometrically, the geometry of the ore body is very, very favorable to stepping up that scale without dramatically changing the sort of the approach to mining it. So what I mean by that is, while we increase the resource quite materially, and that has obvious implications for the scale of the asset and the size of the plant you have to build, from a mining perspective, you're still capturing most of that resource in a single continuous pit. And the phasing of that pit will be very similar to what we released in the PEA, because the grade distribution of the ore body and on this new resource is similar to what we saw in 2019. So there are, the first 5 years will very much still be dominated by that higher grade green oxide material that's located near surface. And we'll push back from that in similar phasing to what we had in the PEA, albeit at a bigger scale. So you are right; it does have implications for plant design and area, obviously, because we're going to be leaching a lot more material than what we had, or we think we'll be leaching a lot more material than what we had in the PEA with the updated scale. But from a mining perspective, we benefit immensely from the nature and the geometry of this ore body being at surface and our strip ratio remaining very low, and the continuous nature of the mineralization as a whole, given we can capture most of the resource in a single continuous pit.
You've also, by pushing out that pit envelope, or those pit walls, or the resource envelope, you've dropped the average grade and the cutoff grade. Does that mean you're going to have to do new metallurgical test work to understand the kind of the behavior of the lower grade portion of the resource? Presumably, you've tested the old average grade, but you probably haven't tested the new average grade.
Correct. I mean, so the ore body is zoned to an extent. So at the core of the ore body, you have the green oxide zones, which are sort of the central part of the pit. And as you move into the peripheries of the ore body, you move more into the lower grade, as you said, halo of black oxides. Now, the WAD component, the black oxide component of the ore body, has been tested in every phase of our metallurgy thus far. So we're relatively confident in our sample set for that going into the DFS. I think we consider our metallurgical test work at this point bankable. There'll be a few additional auxiliary studies we'll have to complete before the DFS on things like particle size distribution, et cetera. But given the robustness of the metallurgical program that Marimaca has completed thus far, particularly with phase 5 in terms of the industrial scale columns that we completed, the variability study, et cetera, we are relatively confident that across the mineralization species in the asset, we have a very, very good idea about the metallurgical performance of each across the various different grade distributions.
And presumably in those column tests, you're getting a better understanding of leach kinetics and kind of permeability flows in a simulated pad environment.
Correct. So a lot of phase 5 was testing at as close to industrial scale conditions that we could, what we put forward in the PEA in terms of our metallurgical design. That was confirmed from our test work in phase 5. So like I said, there'll be a few auxiliary things to finalize in terms of optimizing things like crushing size for permeability purposes ahead of that DFS. But from a core geometallurgical perspective, we have a very, very robust data set moving forward into 2023.
Thank you. I don't want to delve too deep into the technical side of things, but I can't resist. Do you think you're going to have to agglomerate, or is it?
Yes, Marimaca will agglomerate before we stack.
And so, is that cement, or what's your agglomeration kind of?
It'd just be the acid and salt water, and then in the enriched, and so in the later phases of the mine plan, we do actually add some additional salts to what's already a saltwater and acid mix in order to optimize the recoveries on that lower enriched mixed and secondary sulfide zone.
Good. I better stop there, else I'll turn this into a technical talk, which must be avoided at all costs. Thank you very much. So it sounds as if, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds as if the next kind of major announcement is going to be an upgraded resource in Q1 next year.
That's correct. So what happened this year is we cut off data for the 2022 mineral resource update, which we announced at the end of the third quarter, about halfway through the 2022 program. So we captured all of the drilling that was targeted at growing the resource at depth but there's still about 20,000 meters of drilling that we completed in 2022 that was not captured in that resource update. The majority of that is infill towards the northern end of the deposit. And like I said, the goal of that drilling will be, well, the goal of Marimaca will be to capture that drilling in a new resource that we'll look to release in Q1. We don't foresee more scale changes, massive scale changes in that resource. It'll be more about converting our existing inferred, which is about the same proportion of what we had in the previous resource, over to M&I, so that we can use that for the basis of the mine planning and reserve estimates going forward into the DFS.
Great. And then it's kind of fast heads down to getting all the engineering done for the DFS later in 2023, Q4, presumably.
Correct. So I think the big check marks for Marimaca this year were really, from a de-risking perspective, we're really the resource, getting this infill drilling done, which we foresee as the last drilling campaign we'll need for the Marimaca oxide deposit alone before heading into that DFS. And the second was obviously this water option agreement, which was a fantastic achievement for the team led by Laura Rich on the management team of Marimaca and her team down in Chile, which, as you said, is a big element of de-risking any project in Chile, given the sensitivity to water there. And there's flexibility in this option agreement for the water for us to scale up and down the volume requirements depending on where we land from a design perspective on the DFS. So if we end up, larger than where we foresee right now, we have the flexibility in that agreement in order to scale up the volumes that will be allocated. And the same goes for the downside. If we end up on a smaller project, for example, than what we foresee right now, we can shape those volumes accordingly. So the agreement provides enough flexibility that, we have comfort that by the time we execute the water supply agreement at point of FID, we'll have, the flexibility within that to shape it, as we need to.
Nico, thank you very much. And a neat summary, a good update, and perhaps we should meet again when the next resource comes out, perhaps sometime in late Q1 or early Q2.
Absolutely. Thanks very much for having me, Merlin. It was a pleasure chatting today.